Greetings. This is Management 431, the textbook Strategic Staffing. We're in Module 2 and addressing Chapter 5, which is Forecasting and Planning. What we're going to address in this chapter is looking at the different methods that organizations and the managers in organizations have to engage in forecasting and planning. Now, HR does a lot of work gathering the data and working with managers to make sure that they have the tools that they use to help them with forecasting. But broadly speaking, this is a role that largely managers have to play and work in partnership with HR to make sure that they are communicating their staffing needs and their staffing planning needs so that HR can be prepared strategically for what's ahead of them in the next few years. So if I know that you expect a new product launch within the next year, which is going to ramp up our production, and we need a greater sales force to be able to sell that product, then I know from a staffing perspective, I've got to think about manufacturing personnel, workplace safety issues. I've got to make sure that I've got supervisors in place to manage the line, that I've got sales reps in place to do all the selling. So I'd have to be thinking in advance of what I need and start planning in advance for that budgetarily and with resources that are available to us. So we'll be now working through the next 3 little lecturettes on how we do forecasting and how we engage in planning. The learning objectives in this chapter include the following. Number 1, you should be able to describe and work through what workforce planning looks like and what that process looks like. You should be able to discuss how an organization can predict its future business activities, and there's a whole host of different ways in which the organization can predict its future activities. We want to look at how an organization can forecast the demand for workers, which is how many are we going to need. We also need to look at how we can forecast what the supply is. So we need to be able to look at the local labor market as well as what's available in terms of the internal labor market for our employees inside the firm. So it's both about predicting the availability of workers both inside and outside the firm. We want to be able to develop action plans to address the goals and that for the organization in terms of its staffing planning that address the gaps between supply and demand. So we have to have plans in place to manage that. And we want to be able to go through and utilize the staffing planning process. So workforce planning is the process of predicting the organization's employment needs in the future, and also being able to predict what the availability will be both in the organization and what's available in the local labor market to be able to meet those needs. And so it's how we make this plan for having enough people on board to be able to execute the organization's business strategy. So if we have a plan to grow, we need to have enough employees to be able to grow. If we have a plan to stabilize, we don't want to be hiring excess people, nor do we want to actually be understaffing what we need because we need stabilization. If we're going to be shrinking, then we need a layoff plan. So all of these ideas about workforce planning is about making sure that we have the right amount of people in the right place doing the right job to help the organization meet its needs. So making sure we know what talent is available is going to have a huge impact on whether or not we can be successful in achieving our strategy. If we don't have enough people on board, we're not going to be able to do it. If we have too many people, that will cost us too much money, and that will also be an issue for us. So the planning side is really the foundation for good strategic staffing. If we don't have a good plan in place, it doesn't matter what we do, we still may not be able to meet the strategic objectives of the organization. So everybody has to be in the right place at the right time to be able to execute the strategy as the organization plans it. The workforce planning process has very clear steps. Number one, we have to identify what the organization's business strategy is. And so we've already talked about that in the second lecture in the first module when we talked about business and staffing strategy. So we have to know, first of all, what the organization's business strategy is, whether they're differentiation or niche focused or cost leadership focused. So once we identify that, then the firm's talent philosophy and strategic staffing decisions have to be established. So what is it we're going to do? How are we going to do it? Why are we going to do it? So all those things that we talked about in the first module. Then we conduct a workforce analysis, which means we need to know what skill set we have in the organization now, what skill set is available in the local labor market, and what skill set do we need our workers to have. So we're looking at what we need versus what's available to us and what we have in-house, and we have to adapt accordingly. So step 4 is developing and implementing the action plan. So once we conduct that workforce analysis and we determine that we need a certain number of employees at a certain period of time with a specific skill set, we develop our plan for how we're going to recruit those, how we're going to attract them, what rewards we're going to need, what job descriptions and job specs we're going to need, and we get that implemented. All of this has to be in alignment with the business strategy and the firm's talent philosophy and strategic staffing decisions. So all of these things, including recruiting, retention, compensation, succession management, training and development, all of it has to support that firm's business strategy, and which is supported by the talent philosophy. You have to develop a good action plan that can address needs in the short run, but also can address long-term issues and long-term concerns. Now, remember what we've said in some of the other lectures, particularly in job analysis, we were talking about the idea of future jobs, that we don't even know what we need. We don't even know what we don't know. We can try to optimistically, to the best of our ability, develop a job description for a job that just doesn't exist yet. But we also have to recognize that we need to bring in people in those positions who are adaptable and flexible and are willing to learn and grow as the job grows. The last step, of course, is always monitoring, evaluating, and revising your forecasts and action plans. So once you've implemented your plan, we need to go back and monitor its implementation and then look at and evaluate the outcomes. Did we meet the outcomes that we wanted? Did we hire the amount of people that we wanted? Did we get the right quality? Did it match our talent philosophy and strategic staffing plan? Do we need to make adjustments for how that looks? So the goal is you assess your environment through the business strategy, talent philosophy, and strategic staffing plan. You conduct your analysis. You develop a plan to address any gaps that exist, and then you implement that plan, and then you have to evaluate that plan. I mean, these are, basic steps that we know from all kind of planning activities, but this is specific to workforce planning. This is from Chapter 5, Figure 5.1, a visual representation of the workforce planning process. And so again, we start at the bottom left where it says business strategy. What is our business strategy? And based on that business strategy, we then have to look at the subset of issues around strategic staffing and the firm's talent philosophy, how it wants to proceed. From there, it looks at the demand and it looks at the supply and it looks at whether or not we'll be able to match that over time. So, for example, in forecasting the demand, we look at which jobs will the firm need, what competencies will it require, what is the firm's expected level of business activity, is it going to go up, is it going to stabilize, is it going to go down, and then in the end, how many workers are going to be needed. In terms of forecasting the supply of labor, we want to look at which competencies are available. Will the firm be able to find those competencies internally or externally? And how many external workers possess those competencies? So again, we have to look at labor surveys of skill sets in the local area and see where we might find workers, whether it's from traditional sources or non-traditional sources who have those skills. And so we have to look at those things. Now, if there's a gap between what we need and what we have, we've got to fix that gap. So we develop the action plan to address that talent gap. And then after that, we evaluate it. And then, of course, that feeds back into our talent philosophy and our strategic plan. It really should show a feedback loop, even though it doesn't in this particular visual. But, that creates the feedback loop for in the future when we're ready to implement plans. Do we make changes based on what we learned from this staffing process? So what is forecasting? Forecasting is how we predict what we're going to need. And we typically try to predict a range of outcomes from the lowest possible estimate, the most conservative estimate, to the highest, perhaps most generous estimate, and then what is the most probable estimate. So somewhere on a continuum from low to high probability, low preference to high preference, et cetera, et cetera. We recalculate estimates as changes happen in the environment, right? So forecasting isn't a static one time and we're done activity. Forecasting needs to be reassessed regularly as the environment changes. So a new issue happens and we need to go back to our calculated estimates and see if we will still be able to work within those estimates. As changes occur, things that happen in the economy, things that happen, in elections or, new laws that get passed suddenly, we need to take into consideration all of those changes. And so we always have to be assessing the environment for that. Forecasting our staffing needs directly follows from forecasts about business activities. So we first need to know what are the company's activities, what are they planning to engage in, what do we know about if we're globally exchange rates and interest rates and competitors and other economic factors. If we are competing locally, if there are seasonal changes that we need to take into consideration. And our goal is to find, as it says here, reliable, high quality information sources that we can use to help us forecast the business activity. And that's really the job of again, the people who are involved in production and people who are involved in setting production goals, is they need to let us know, first of all, what are the forecasted needs in terms of changes in seasonality or interest rates or economic conditions and things like that. Once we have that information, then we can start considering what the staffing needs are going to be based on what we know about the business activities and the business forecasts. The first thing that we need to do is forecast our labor demand. So we want to look at what the minimum is that we need to meet our labor demand, and then look at what the ideal is. I mean, clearly we recognize that there's no perfect world where we're going to have exactly every number of employee that we need to meet demand and meet requirements absolutely available for us. There are going to be times when there's labor shortages. We won't have enough people to do something. There might be times when there's a glut of workers and we don't have enough jobs to give them. So we want to look at what we minimally need and what we optimally need. So we make sure that when we're doing our forecasting, we have a range that we're going to be working within, and have a full range of predictions or forecasts based on minimum expectations and optimal expectations. As I said in the previous slide, our demand for labor depends on the forecasted business activity. As productivity goes up, we need less employees. As production goes up, we need more employees. So it's a fine-tuned equalizer with all sorts of factors that we need to take into consideration, not just, what we need in terms of the productivity of our workers, but also what's going on in terms of demand, what's going on in the economy. If we're in a bad economy and people aren't spending money and we make, expensive ski outfits, right? Who's going to buy them, right? Very few people. There will be always people who are going to buy, but not at the same level that it would be if we had a booming economy where people were making money hand over fist. So there's lots of factors we need to take into account. Business needs can include things that like what are listed here: achieving the staffing levels necessary for generating a given amount of revenue within a particular period of time. So we can think about, if we want to generate this kind of revenue, how many sales reps do we need to be able to do that? We want to think about, if we're in a growth strategy, how many more people are we going to need to address that growth strategy if we're growing in leaps and bounds in new locations or new divisions and departments? If we're going to restructure the company through some business process reengineering, streamlining what we do, we need to think about decreasing the staffing levels. And so that may be a concern for us. Where are we going to decrease? What method are we going to use to decrease? And do we decrease based on seniority, the last in, first out method? Do we decrease based on early retirement plans? Or do we decrease our staffing needs based on productivity and layoffs in that area? Lastly, another thing that we can do is obtaining new talent based on creating new products or providing different services. So we might be innovating internally and decide, wow, we're going to do this new product or this new service, and now we need new people with a new skill set to meet the demands of this new product or service that we're offering. So these are just examples of different business needs, and they cover most of the ideas, but obviously it's not exhaustive. Ratio analysis is a great tool for forecasting because it's usually based on historic usage of staffing patterns. For example, we would need a certain number of employees for a certain number of sales. We need a certain number of employees for a certain level of production. And so we look at historically how many employees we've needed in order to be able to meet a particular demand, whether it's a productivity demand or a sales demand or whatever demand that we're using. And we also have to take into account the productivity rate of our employees, whether or not we're going to train them so that they are more productive. If we are going to also invest in technology that would allow workers to do more work with less. So we would have less employees, but we'd have technology to sort of fill the gap by having less employees. So there's a whole host of things that go into the ratio analyses that we need to take into account. As I said, we use the historical patterns to help us figure out what would be a reasonable range for the ratios, and that we can use this ratio analysis to justify a new position or justify the fact that we're overstaffed and we may need to get rid of a whole bunch of people. So the only way we can do ratio analysis is if we have a pretty reasonable history of trends in terms of the number of employees needed for productivity reasons or sales reasons. It's very hard for a new company to use a ratio analysis because what they're doing is very different than other companies, and then they don't have a consistent historical record of how they have worked because they're in growth mode, and they're going to have very different needs based on that growth mode. Here's a great example of a bunch of different types of ratios that we can use. We can use production to number of employees, so how much production is needed to the number of employees that we've historically used to meet production needs. And of course, as you know from the Management 430 simulation, that ratio is going to vary depending on how productive the employees are. If they become more productive, they can do more output, you need less employees. So things to consider. Revenue per employee, and we know historically over a couple of decades that at a certain level of revenue, we need more employees. Managers to employees. So the ratio that we want to have with managers to employees. Now, in the 1970s and the 1980s, organizations tended to be very tall and thin, meaning that there were more managers per employee. So you'd have one manager to 4 employees, for example, or one manager to 5 employees, which is a narrow span of control. And over time, as we've flattened organizations, as the organizational hierarchy has removed a lot of middle management, we've now thinned it out. So we might have one manager for 7 or 8 or 10 or 15 employees. So there are more direct reports per manager, which flattens the organizational structure, but puts a lot more stress on the manager to be able to meet those needs. And so you may find that your company may be in a transition where you're going from a tall, thin bureaucratic structure to a flatter, leaner structure, in which case then your manager to employee ratio is going to need to change, and you need to keep that take that into account as you're doing your calculations. We may also look at inventory levels to the number of employees. And again, particularly if we're producing a lot of goods, we want to make sure that we are addressing that accordingly. The number of customers or customer orders to employee. Again, we want to make sure we have enough customers in place, enough employees in place to meet customer demand. Labor cost to all production costs. And so we want to look at how we want to manage our labor costs relative to production costs if we are producing things at a very tight profit margin. So someone like Walmart might sell goods with a very narrow profit margin, so they're going to pay close attention to their labor costs. Another variable that we can use is the percent utilization of production capacity to the number of employees. So as we approach full capacity of our production abilities, we need more employees, and so that might be another way of thinking about the ratio. As we reach full capacity, we need more employees. As our capacity decreases and we have less capacity in the organization, then we need less employees. Scatterplots are a great way of showing the relationship between two variables. For example, this one shows level of revenue and then the staffing level. So specifically, how many drivers we need given the population that we're serving. And this would be a big issue with FedEx drivers or UPS drivers or ambulance drivers, anything that involves covering a territory. Even postal workers would be the same sort of situation. So we graph, population or revenue, we graph staffing, whatever it is that we need, and we then look at the relationship between the two. And then if we realize if your dependent variable, the stuff on the x-axis, goes up or down, we then know, following the graph, roughly speaking, with a line of best fit, where we should be at in terms of the number of drivers. And so this is a great example of creating a line of best fit, predicting X, meaning the population served, predicting Y, the number of drivers, put that into a quick regression, and we can look at where it is on the graph and then figure out how many employees we need based on that. Trend analysis is one way that we can predict future needs. And basically what trend analysis does is it uses past employment patterns to predict future needs. And I like the example they give here. I don't see any point in recreating the wheel. So the example they say is if a company's been growing 5% annually for the last 8 years, it's going to assume that it will experience the same 5% annual growth for the next few years. This is not a bad idea. It's a good rule of thumb, but there are many factors that can go into predicting growth or demand, and economic conditions can change on the dime. A great example of this was the housing crash in 2008. I put my house on the market in 2006 when I moved from New York State here to Illinois to take my job at SIUE, and the house didn't sell, and the market started to shrink. And then it finally, in 2008, we were finally able to identify what the problem was because of the housing bubble. The housing market crashed. Finally, it hit its low in 2008. But who could have predicted that? Who could have predicted that that trend was going to change? And that's the thing that we need to be aware of, that you can't assume that growth or development is going to continue on in perpetuity. There are many factors that we can't control for, or we can't predict, that are going to have an impact on whether or not your employment patterns are going to be the same into the future. So we need to be looking at all sorts of economic indicators to know whether or not this is a reasonable tool to use. And so, as I said, trends are useful, but they're not the only factor. So, as it talks about here in the bottom bullet point, because there are so many factors that affect staffing needs, competition, economic environment, changes in how the company works and gets work done through automation or technology. Trend analysis cannot be used alone. So we want to make sure we use a multitude of tools, but trend analysis is a good baseline. Figure 5.3 from your textbook shows you a really great example of trend analysis, and this is looking at the number of full-time workers, some of which are internationally educated, some of which are domestically educated, and this goes from the period of '06 to 2013, and it looks at the trend in internationally educated nurses, full-time nurses, has gone up, and we find that we have fewer domestically educated nurses in the job market. So if I'm a hospital or if I'm a home nursing agency or something like that, I have to be aware of that I may need to go to international schools to have an exchange and bring nurses in to be able to work in my company. So I have to know these kinds of trends over time to figure out what's been done in the past and where I see the trend moving into the future. Judgmental forecasting is another tool that we can use to be able to predict our future needs. A top-down approach means that the top management team, organization leaders, develop the predictions on the staffing needs, and then the top managers' estimates become the goals, and they get implemented downward into the organization. As it says here, in some cases, particularly when companies are facing financial difficulties or restructuring, budgets may determine those headcount numbers. And so we are more likely to see a top-down approach when a company is facing really tough, difficult financial situations. I'm not saying that's always the best approach, but I think they tend to turn to centralization of decision-making when things are harsh. And when things are good and flush, and we've got lots of money and we've got lots of opportunities, we tend to relinquish some of the reins and we allow for a bottom-up approach or a more decentralized approach. For me, in my mind, I think a bottom-up approach, and many, many times, is the best approach. I think when you, as a top manager, you need to provide to your lower managers the constraints that you're working within and what your expectations are and what you're looking for. And I think I take a very theory Y approach to managers, where I believe that if you give them the guidelines and you give them empowerment, autonomy, mastery, and purpose, they're going to come up with a good plan to do the best thing for the company. And it's not going to be based on fear or reaction, but it's actually going to be based on realistic estimates, because they're the ones in the front line doing the work every day. So the top-down approach, happens, as I say here, when things are financially difficult. Usually the top management team makes the decision, but I prefer a more bottom-up approach, where I believe the lower-level managers, with the guidance from the top management team, know what the parameters are to work within, what are the constraints. They come up with the plans to execute and then make the recommendations in terms of staffing. And I think that gets the organization a long way in terms of empowering workers and getting their buy-in and getting their connection and engagement with the company. One of the challenges we have with judgment is that oftentimes judgment can be biased. Decision-making can be biased. And so it's really important, if we're going to have elements of managerial judgment in the forecasting or decision-making process, that we balance it with supplemental information like ratio analysis or scatterplots or trend analysis. Because if we don't have some data to work off of, even, you're not going to always have the best judgment. Our hindsight is always, 20/20. We always remember, oh yeah, I'm sure I knew that, or I could have predicted that ages ago, when really it's flawed. We can't predict things like that accurately all the time. I think we have a better better sense of our memory for things than we actually do. And so the goal is to use mechanical methods and supplement with managerial judgment. And this is really important, again, for situations like trend forecasting, right? You're using past data to predict the future. Well, the past data isn't going to continue on ad infinitum, as we've said, so we need to use managerial judgment with the data to recognize that this is a trend that's probably going to stop, because it's going to start to flatten. We're saturated, or we see some forecasted bad economic conditions coming up, so the productivity may drop or profitability may drop. So I think using both mathematical tools like ratios and scatterplots and forecasting, trend forecasting, in conjunction with managerial judgment, get you your best options. Return on investment analysis is a useful tool in all aspects of the business, not just in hiring, productivity, or services, right? It's also in the return on investment we make for investing in a particular employee, and we take into account all sorts of factors, including the cost to advertise, attract them to the company, bring them to the company for interviews, et cetera, traveling expenses, training expenses, all these things. So return on an investment is going to be a metric that you need to be comfortable using, and we'll get some practice doing that in the simulation. So with the ROI, we're going to estimate the return on investment for adding a new position based on the costs and outcomes resulting from that hire. So we have to, first of all, assign a dollar value to the benefits. And what do we mean by that? Well, will we get more sales? Will we get greater productivity? What do we expect from this new hire? So there has to be a dollar value attached to that. How much revenue is a great example, as it says there. How much money will it save your company by being more efficient or having better quality or customer service? Then we compare the costs or the benefits that you expect with the costs to hire, the cost to advertise, the cost to interview, the cost to train. Add this to the compensation for the new position. So the cost for the payroll for that person, plus all those additional costs like the hiring costs and the training costs and the travel costs. And you calculate your return on investment based on that. So you compare this amount with the value your company will gain to determine the return on the investment of adding the new position. So the goal, of course, is that your benefits should more than outweigh your costs. And in the simulation, it's really important that you have selection tools that will give you maximum gain for minimal cost. So we want to use selection tools that will give us the biggest bang for the buck and get us a good return on our investment.